Morning, everybody. We'll make a start. I think we'll probably have a few more people joining us over the next few minutes, but we've got quite a lot to get through this morning. So thank you all for joining us. We run these application seminars as frequently as we can, one per funding round, to support applicants throughout their the application journey. So I'm joined by my colleagues Andrew Cripps and Simon Carman, who will talk you through the application form and some of the scoring criteria and some of the technical elements of the application as well. So before we kick off, just a little bit of housekeeping from me. This all should be fairly straightforward, given that we've been doing these for quite some time now. But if you could all mute yourselves during the presentations, keep your cameras turned off. If you do have any questions, please type those into the chat function. And we're recording the session today, so you'll be able to watch it back at your leisure. So just a brief agenda for today. I'm going to give you an overview of the application process and the form itself. Then I'll hand over to Simon, who will talk about the financial and economic assessment model. So it's really important that you understand this element when you're applying for HNIP funding. Then Andrew will talk about some of the technical inputs in regards to the application itself, and we'll just close with an overview of some of the guidance and help that's available from the team. Just a timeline of where we're at. So we are looking to publish updated application guidance hopefully this month. So we'll give you a overview of yeah, sorry, the slides will be shared after the session. Apologies, I should have said that earlier on. So yeah, we're hoping to publish updated application guidance. We'll give you an overview of some of the things that we've included in this new version. The pre-application deadline for the current funding round is the 2nd of December, with the full application deadline in the beginning of the new year. And our final funding round closes in October next year. We have funded a number of projects, and you can find out a bit more about those on our website. The link's on screen, or you could just visit tpheatnetworks.org and have a look around there and see some of the projects that have been successful. And just a reminder, really, we will be sending around a feedback form. We really appreciate your feedback on all of our events and all of the engagement that you're having with the team, as it helps us improve what the things that we're doing, and hopefully we're able to provide a bespoke service for you. So in terms of the application guidance, over the last couple of years, we have published a number of clarification documents. So these documents are separate to the guidance, and they go into a bit more detail on things like eligible costs, some of the timelines for assessment, how we calculate the counterfactual technology in terms of cost and also carbon. We have produced a clarification on special purpose vehicles as well, and what we mean by a credit-worthy organisation. Now, these documents have been available for a while, but what we've tried to do is incorporate them into the main application guidance to reduce the need to be flicking between lots of different documents. So these have now been incorporated, so we're hoping to publish those. There's a few other things that we've added or updated. So the interest rates that are commented on within the document have been updated. Obviously, these are subject to change on an ongoing basis, but we've brought them up to date. Since publishing the application guidance, we've also published the standardised due diligence sets and the template HEAP contracts. So links to both of those have been added into the guidance. We've also added a little bit more information around scoring, and I'll come on to that a bit later. An updated document checklist, some information around your procurement strategy and what we'd like to see within that. We've updated the text around finalising the funding agreements and the different stages, when we expect to hear back from you and things like that if you are successful. And we've added links to the monitoring and reporting guidance, updated some of the financial model specifications, and the HNIP cash flow as well. So like I said, we're hoping to publish this very soon, and a note will be sent round to the whole of the mailing list once it's available. So hopefully you're all fairly familiar with the application process, but I'll just give you a bit of a quick run through. I mentioned a pre-application deadline and a full application deadline. We ask all applicants to submit a pre-application. At this point, we check your eligibility, and we ask you to provide a high-level project overview. Assuming that you're eligible for HNIP, we will invite you to proceed to a full application, and at this point you need to provide more detailed project information and financials, so it's a more complex application form that you need to submit. The application form is an Excel file. Both the pre-application and the full application are contained within the same document, and to submit them to us, you need to upload them alongside all of your supporting documents to our DAS, our data and application system, with the link on screen there. And I'm pleased to say we're joined actually by Amy Fry, who is one of our business development managers, but Amy and Lauren are available to help you throughout the whole process, so please do reach out if you have any questions. If for whatever reason you are unsuccessful, either at the pre-application or the full application stage, we will provide you with feedback on why that was. So obviously at the pre-application stage, it will be a notification as to whether you were successful or not, and we'd outline some of the areas where you've failed to meet our eligibility criteria. And then at full application stage, if you are unsuccessful, we'll provide you with more detailed written feedback and invite you to resubmit or work on particular areas to make your scheme more competitive against the others in the funding round that you are submitting into. So yeah, just a reminder, if anyone does have any questions, please do send them through. I appreciate that I'm going through this fairly quickly. So the application form itself consists of a number of different tabs. We ask you for basic contact information, governance of the scheme. We ask you to self-certify that you meet eligibility criteria. We obviously want to understand the size of your network, the carbon savings that you expect to see, the technologies that you're going to be using. We look to understand whether your project is strategic. So within the application guidance, we outline what we mean by strategic, so it's worth having a look at that. We want to understand the conversations that you're having with different stakeholders, the different off-takers that you might be speaking to. We then want to look at the technical side, so I'll be handing over to Andrew to go into a bit more detail about that. We want to understand the finance structures and whether you're on investing any of the HNIP funds, for example. We want to understand the governance structure and also how you're going to deliver the heat network itself. And then finally, we have the theme data sheets, which Simon will explain in a bit more detail. So this is a screenshot of the application form. You can download the application form from our website. The link is on screen. We do occasionally update the application form either to fix bugs that have appeared, but also to improve usability and make some areas clearer. So do send through any feedback that you have, because we are able to amend this on an intermittent basis. So yeah, just make sure that you've got the most up-to-date application form before you start. If you've already started to make changes to one form and we make an update, just let us know, and we're able to transfer your data onto the new application form to save you some time, because we're aware of where those changes have been made, so we're able to transfer the data quite easily. So before you start completing the forms, we recommend that you read all of the documents carefully, so that includes the application guidance. To start completing the form, you'll need to enable editing and enable content, and you'll also need to accept the disclaimer at the front of the application guidance, the application form, and this will allow you to complete the remainder of the form. As you work your way through, you will see some notes next to some of the different cells. So these tend to be in red. You can see on the sort of right-hand side of your screen, there's some red text there. It gives you a little indication as to what we're expecting to see in response to that question. And if we ask you for references or evidence, it would be really useful if you could let us know the name of the document as your the file name that you'll upload alongside your application form, and also whereabouts in that document we can find the relevant information. It just helps our assessors find those particular bits of information. There are also a number of hidden questions throughout the form. There are some questions that won't be relevant to you for whatever reason, based on the type of scheme that you have or the way you answer specific questions. So for example here, if you respond no to the question here about offtake agreements, you will just need to scroll down to the next available question. However, if you select yes, you will get asked a series of questions that ask about your offtake agreements in more detail. So please make sure that you scroll down to the very bottom of the page to make sure you haven't missed off any questions as you work your way through. Are there any questions on the application form itself? Nope. Okay. So just some things to consider in summary. Please work through the entire workbook, answering all the questions, as they may reveal additional questions as you work your way through. You will need to provide evidence to support some of the responses that you provide. This includes your funding plan and your financial model. We may have to come back and ask for additional evidence if you don't provide it initially, and this could slow things down. Make sure any approvals and documentation are up to date when you submit them to us. And I've already mentioned, but clearly highlight where in the additional documentation we should be looking for that particular reference. Indications of timescales for project milestones will need to be provided, and don't leave your application to the last minute, particularly your full application, as it's quite a detailed form. We are all available to help you through the process. I mentioned the business development managers, but we've got a wider team of support that we can meet with you as often as you need on the way up to submitting your application. and answer any questions that you might have. Finally, projects are expected to show that their heat network would have positive returns without any HNIP support, so that you would have a positive IRR without HNIP support. So just worth bearing that in mind. Our awards must be less than 50% of the capital expenditure of the network. It's worth being aware that the closer you come to this 50% limit, the less competitive you're likely to be against other projects within the funding round. So it's definitely not a target. Be wary of having too much contingency within your project. You are able to include contingency in your costs, but be wary of having too much there. And then our scoring, which we'll come on to in a bit more detail later, but our scoring is based on a range of factors, including heat delivered divided by gross grant equivalent and carbon saved divided by gross grant equivalent. Andrew, I don't know if you wanted to jump in here or.
Yes, okay. So gross grant equivalent, as the name implies, is the value of the award converted as if it were converted into a grant. I think Simon will talk about this later, but basically a loan. Some schemes are more suitable to loans, and others can only work with grant. And the loan is of a lower value. So the essence of the whole purpose of HNIP is to enable projects to happen which deliver significant amounts of new heat and bring carbon savings. And so obviously, so that's rewarded in the competition, and the schemes which deliver the largest amounts of heat and carbon are the ones which are most likely to be funded. And just to pick up on that, in the next paragraph here, we've introduced in the guidance, the new version of the guidance that Sam was telling you about, which isn't published yet, these two quite important pieces of information, which are the values which we are tasked with achieving for the programme as a whole, and it's useful for you to know, to get a sense of whether your scheme is good in terms of heat delivered and carbon saved, or not so good. And so these two figures, 85 and 7,500, these represent approximately what the scheme as a whole is seeking to achieve. So projects that do better than these figures are going to be helpful to us and more likely to be funded. Projects which are lower than this may still be funded. You don't have to reach these levels to be funded, but obviously if you're a long way from these levels, then your project's is less likely to be funded. Important to point out, this is calculated over 15 years, not just a single year. So the way your scheme builds up over time matters a certain amount, but essentially these are the key metrics. Back to you, Sam.
Thanks, Andrew. Are there any questions at the moment for me or for the team? Okay, I'll hand over to Simon then.
Good morning. Should I? There we go. Share. Sorry, just doing the technology. Okay, I'm Simon Carman. We're responsible for having developed the financial economic assessment model and for kind of applying the model during the assessment process to generate a number of the scored metrics. So the model itself, the theme, forms an important part of the assessment process. As I said, it generates 3 of the 4 scored metrics that generate the overall score for an applicant, and it does a number of almost pass-fail or indicative tests as well. within the model. So I'll spend a bit of time talking through the model because we don't share the model with the applicant community, but I'm happy to explain it in some detail in relation to how it works and what it does. It's been developed bespoke for this application process, and the yellow tabs within the application form that are prefixed with theme are the tabs that feed information into the financial and economic assessment model in order for us to generate the outputs. So if I can go down. Okay, so as part of the application process, we ask applicants to provide their own financial model, which is either a stage 1 or a stage 2 model, and that's defined in Appendix E, see section 5.6 of Appendix E, and as well as completing the theme sections of the application form, the yellow tabs. Now we recognise that your financial model is developed to suit your decision making purposes, and is almost certainly going to be generating numbers that are nominal and post tax and post financing. Our assessment is done on a real basis, no inflation. It's done pre-tax and pre-finance. So ideally, it helps us quite a lot if your model can generate the internal rates of return that our model generates as an initial stage, so that we can kind of reconcile the numbers back to each other, and we do a reconciliation. So I'm not going to talk any more about your financial model, but I'm going to talk about the theme a bit more. So fundamentally, the theme indicates the required level of HNIP support for each project, the funding gap. This is a central concept within the application process. So your financial information will generate what we call a pre-intervention internal rate of return. Again, that's real pre-tax, pre-financing, a kind of project internal rate of return, and that rate of return, as Sam mentioned, needs to be above 0. You tell us what a commercial rate of return is for you, and we then size an intervention, either a grant intervention or a loan intervention, that raises the pre-intervention IRR up to your hurdle rate IRR that you notify us about. So that's fundamentally what it does. It also generates 3 key scored metrics for the assessment of applications. It generates a metric that is the total heat generated by the scheme divided by the gross grant equivalent to the intervention. So as Andrew mentioned, the gross grant equivalent of £1's worth of grant is £1. The gross grant equivalent of a loan it depends on how subsidised the loan is. So it's akin to a kind of state aid view of the world, gross grant equivalent. So the more subsidised the loan is from the public sector, the higher the gross grant equivalent will be. And the closer to market rates is the lower the gross grant equivalent to that loan will be. So we take the total heat generated by the scheme divided by the gross grant equivalent, which gives you a kind of, the more heat generated for less intervention generates a higher score. We have a similar concept for the total amount of carbon dioxide saved. So the total CO2 saved is essentially the amount of CO2 that is generated by your scheme compared with the amount of CO2 that would have been generated by a counterfactual. Subtract one from the other, that gives you the CO2 saved, and again divide it by the gross grant equivalent to the intervention. Again, the more carbon saved per pound of intervention or per pound gross grant equivalent to intervention, the higher the score. And then there's a final scored metric that is the volume of carbon dioxide saved through future decarbonisation and expansion. And there are 2 tabs within the application form that collect the information in relation to future decarbonisation and expansion. One looks at decarbonisation through introducing new, better, cleaner generation technologies at some time in the future, and the other looks at bringing on board new customers. The model also carries out a number of tests. As Sam mentioned, social net present value is important. So in terms of when the program was set up, the business case for the program at governmental level showed that a total intervention of whatever the total pot of money is, I think it's 320 million, generates a positive social net present value. So at a scheme level, we calculate social net present value, which is a kind of HM Treasury Green Book calculation, and we compare the net present value of your scheme with the net present value of the counterfactual, and hopefully there is positive net present value by undertaking your scheme. If it's positive, that's all good. If it isn't, we go through a process to explore why that might be the case with you, and then there's the potential for it to be referred to BEIS, and if the case is made that the project is sufficiently strategic, BEIS might choose to fund the project even if there's a negative social net present value. Another test is customer detriment. So an aim of the program is that no customer should pay more than they would otherwise have paid, but actually in reality that test is applied to residential and social residential customers rather than commercial or industrial customers. So we look at the degree to which social and residential customers pay the same or slightly less than they would have done had the scheme not been implemented. And again, we explore if the model indicates that that's not happening, we explore that further. And the final test that the model does, which is looking increasingly irrelevant as we move towards the end of December, but government hasn't yet decided where it is, I don't think, in relation to state aid. So we still undertake a state aid test. So we check that the intervention that we're suggesting your project needs on the basis of funding the gap isn't going to generate a state aid issue against the allowable aid that your project will attract. A little bit more about social net present value on the there was a pilot to the main scheme, the pilot to HNIP, and which I worked through a number of projects. And on the pilot, applicants were asked to calculate the SNPV with guidance. It's quite a technical calculation and a very public sector focused calculation, and it caused a number of issues in relation to making sure that was done consistently. So for the main scheme, we don't ask you to calculate the SNPV. In effect, it's a black box calculation that we do, that you don't get sight of the calculation itself, and we ask you for very little data for us to calculate it. So it's a fairly generic calculation where we ask what the counterfactual technology type is for your customers, and then we come up with a kind of proxy cost, capital, OPEX costs, and we add in the costs of carbon generated and other emissions that are generated, which turns it into a social net present value. So our model does that calculation. If you wish, because it is a black box, if you wish to satisfy yourself that you're okay on the SNPV, and the vast majority of projects are okay on that, then you're welcome to ask us in advance of submitting your application. If that's what you wish, you can ask us to give you some feedback on the SNPV. I just although we're trying to be helpful by doing that, I just provide a little warning that you need to provide us with most of the data. Almost all of the data will need to be provided for the model to calculate it, but that offer's there, and we can discuss that with you if that's a concern to you. And I've already mentioned that if the project doesn't have a positive SMPV, it can still be eligible for funding if it's deemed strategic. In relation to the counterfactual, so the counterfactual that I mentioned a couple of times now is important for the SMPV, the social net present value calculations. It's also important for the customer detriment test. And we've issued a clarification note that's available on the website in relation to the counterfactuals, and essentially all we ask is that on the demand input sheet for each of your listed customers, there's a drop down menu that asks you to indicate what the counterfactual technology type would be for that customer. And then we ask you for a little bit more information against that customer, like for instance, if it's a tower block, how many residences there are in there. So if, for instance, you were to choose gas boiler as the counterfactual and it was a residential tower block with 100 flats in it, then our model would calculate 100 gas boilers and the capital cost for that and the replacement cost for 100 gas boilers and the annual maintenance cost for 100 gas boilers, plus the gas cost to supply the heat those boilers are generating. So that's in a very simplistic sense how the counterfactual technology costs are worked up. It's based on standard Bayes assumptions. It's they're standardized across the country, so they don't take account of geographical areas, and they only have a relatively few number of counterfactual types. So it's a fairly blunt calculation. And we use published guidance in relation to valuing the energy usage and the greenhouse gas emissions.
Simon, if I can just jump in on that, we go back to that one. I think I missed you saying, if you did, that when you put your scheme in, or you're going to come back to this later on, when you put your scheme in, every connection could have a different counterfactual in principle, and yes. So we recognise that there'll be different buildings on your network that you're supplying heat to, and the counterfactual is mostly pretty easy because it's whatever's in the building at the moment. So if you're connecting to a building that's got a gas boiler, the counterfactual is obviously a gas boiler. The area that can be a bit complicated is when you're connecting to a building that isn't built yet. And then between us, we have to agree what would have been built if you didn't have the heat network. And where this is complicated is, for example, in London, where we're moving to the point where most new buildings have something other than the gas boiler, typically an air source heat pump. So we're beginning to see air source heat pump as the counterfactual in some new buildings, and you just need to approach this in a rational way so that we're all comfortable that the appraisal is being done correctly. Back to you, Simon.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Andrew. That was helpful. Yeah. So I'm rattling through this. I'm hoping to actually dive into the application form spreadsheet. So I'm going through fairly quickly. Let me figure out how Okay, please do send in questions, and we'll respond to them as they come in. Okay, just a little bit. So some people find this helpful, some people don't. This is just because we're not sharing the model. It's just a picture really of how the model works in terms of its inputs, its calculations, and its outputs. So inputs at the top, outputs at the bottom on this diagram, and on the left, as I'm looking at it, we have the project inputs and calculations, and on the right we have the counterfactual calculations and inputs. So right at the bottom we have the outputs that I talked about, which are the heat generated divided by the gross grant equivalent, the carbon dioxide saved. So the carbon dioxide saved is in comparison with the counterfactual. the decarbonisation and expansion comes from its own data inputs. They're the three scored metrics, and then there's the SNPV benefit and the customer detriment test, and the state aid test as well over to the left. So you provide us with pretty much all of the data for your scheme. You provide cash flow inputs, capex, repex, revenue, operating costs, fuel costs, obviously the key ones, as well as some of the technical physical inputs in relation to capacities and efficiencies and fuel use, etc. So that works its way down in terms of calculating the intervention sum through the cash flow analysis and the internal rate of return calculation, and it generates some of the other metrics. The counterfactual on the right then takes very, very simple inputs from you by customer type, which is essentially the counterfactual technology type, and then it uses a load of standing data within the model to generate the outputs, both the levelized heat tariff and the SNPV calculation. Again, part of the challenge actually here is to ensure that the way we capture the data in the theme data input sheets within the application form is done in the way that most accurately represents your project within the theme. So the theme is a little bit of a straitjacket. It's been designed to accommodate all types of project, and we thought there would be a fairly standard project, and with a small handful of unusual project types, but actually every single project we've seen has been quite distinct, but it stood up so far to be able to accommodate everything that's been thrown at it. So the open invitation to have conversations with us and to have one-to-one Teams calls, etc., about how you present your data within the data input sheets, it typically focuses on how you can best represent your particular project within our data input sheets, and we're very happy to have those conversations to make sure that the theme represents your project as accurately as possible. So the theme was built entirely bespoke, so we didn't start with a project finance model or with an energy balancing model, or we didn't start with anything other than a blank spreadsheet. We built the dashboard outputs first, and those outputs were entirely focused on what the application metrics were and what the data was that was needed to support the assessment process, and then the model was built backwards to generate that information. We use a standard model for all projects rather than your models in order to ensure satisfy ourselves that we're treating applications consistently. It also helps us in relation to the model assurance. So with model assured the theme, so we place reliance on it. It means we don't need to ask for you to model assure your models as part of the process. We have within the data input sheet, so there's a lot that some of the sheets within the application form ask for kind of narrative information that is assessed as part of the technical assessment or the deliverability assessment. We ask for typically data, and some of that data, not all of the data asked for in the theme input sheets goes into the theme. Some of that data is used to help support the deliverability assessment and to cross-check against some of the description of your project elsewhere in the application form. We pay attention to the potential for applicants to game the application, and I guess what I mean by gaming it is to present present the project in a way that maximises the amount of intervention that is secured, rather than presenting the application in the way that most accurately represents the scheme. So we look out for that, and because it's a standard model with calculations that we understand, we can sometimes spot things that look a little out of place. And as I've mentioned before, the theme, the section within it that calculates the social net present value, removes that requirement for applicants to do that calculation, which was felt to be quite onerous at the pilot study stage. Okay, so we'll get into it very shortly. So the theme itself, the input sheets are yellow tabs. I've listed them there. There is actually an additional one that I haven't listed here because it's called theme. I think it's called theme theme network, theme pipes or something. We'll see in a second. But it doesn't. The data in there doesn't go into the theme. So if it doesn't go into the theme, I don't pay much attention, which is probably my failing. So we've got the network input tabs, the demand input tabs, cost input tabs, and then the two that relate to future decarbonisation. We tried very, very hard to only have outputs from the model that support the application process. So whilst you can think up lots and lots of interesting information to generate through financial modelling, we resisted anything that wasn't contributing to the assessment process, and the main reason for that was to generate as small a data set requirement that we're asking for from applicants as we thought it was possible. So we think that we're asking for a minimal data set from you guys. It might not seem it from your side, but we have tried very hard to minimise the amount of data that we've asked for from you. So they're within those sheets. There's some formatting styles. Inputs are in yellow. There are some calculations, particularly some reconciliation calculations, and there are some checks with ticks and crosses within it as well that you might want to pay some attention to. Could you be super careful, please, with the units, the structure, and the formatting, because well, we've locked the model down, so even if you're able to break the protection on it, if you add a column or you add a row, it will mess up our mapping, because what we do is we just hook the application form straight up to the theme, and it looks for data in the cells that it's expecting it to find it in. So any kind of change to the structure messes it up completely. In terms of units, all the financial numbers are in pounds, thousands, please. If you just put it in pounds, and we see quite a lot of applications coming in pounds, then that will mess up any comparison with the counterfactual, which is in pounds, thousands. It will make your scheme look screamingly expensive compared to the counterfactual. We'll spot that straight away, and we'll come back to you and ask for that to be rectified. But we then miss one of the. We have a relatively short window to ask clarifications, and I'd much rather ask clarifications on meaningful issues that we generally don't understand, rather than fixing relatively simple data entry issues. So please, pounds, thousands, positive numbers, even for costs, and have a look at what the units are if we're asking for kilowatt hours as opposed to megawatt hours, or if we're asking for tariffs, we're asking for pence per kilowatt hour. Please give us pence rather than pounds and stuff like that. So just pay a bit of attention to the units, please. And we were happy to provide one-to-one sessions, as I've already mentioned. I'll come to the timescales in just a second. So, in relation to timescales, this is another important issue. You'll see in the data input sheets that they go out to year 60. We recognise that some projects might only have be expected to last 40-45 years. That might be the commercial length of the investment, but I'm afraid, need 60 years worth of data. So because the numbers are real, they're not inflated, the best way to do that is usually just to block repeat sets of costs. So you'll have replacement costs. You might be replacing some items of capital every 15 years, so you'll have 4 replacements over a 60-year period, and just assume that your scheme continues as it was first implemented. We deal with changes to the generation technology. So if you put a gas CHP in on year 1, just assume that you're replacing the gas CHP at year 20 or whenever you might replace it, going forward. So that's a pragmatic approach to providing us with 60 years worth of data. We need 60 years because the counterfactual calculation is done over 60 years for the SMPV calculation. So the longest line on there in terms of the appraisal period is the SMPV calculation, which is done over 60 years. The decision around that time period was around how long it was deemed that the longest lasting asset might last. So the other calculations within the model, there's the project carbon saving metric, which is the amount of CO2 saved divided by the GGE. That's done over a 15-year period. The amount of heat delivered divided by the GGE is done over a 15-year period. Future decarbonisation is done over a 30-year period. So, but in order for us to have a degree of certainty over those proposed changes, it has to be either new technologies that are thought will be implemented within the first 15 years, or new customers that will come online within the first 15 years. And then we will then roll out the benefit of that for the next, well, up to 30 years. So that's done over 30-year time period. The intervention appraisal period, so when we're calculating what your intervention is, what the IRRs are in relation to that, pre-intervention and post-intervention, they're done over a 40-year period. And the state aid test, just for good measure, is done over a 25-year period.
Simon, can I just pop back? Because something I wanted to add on this slide. So it's Andrew Cripps here again. So this slide is actually quite important in a lot of ways in understanding the way the application works, and in particular the orange block, the project heat. That is what we define as the project, and it's labelled here as phase 1. But please don't mix that up with however you're phasing your project, which may be quite different. So the orange section is the project, and that is all the connections you're expecting to make in a period of time that you define, but it must match the capex that you give as the capex for the scheme, and the revenue for the scheme, and the fuel used and everything. So we expect all of that needs to be self-consistent, and it all goes, and Simon's about to show you where that goes on the application form. And then any extra customers and expansion and so on, that's all in the light blue bit, the additional heat. And those parts don't need to be costed. Those are things which you're planning to expand in the future, but those aren't included in the financial analysis. So this is a really, really important distinction, that you are clear, that we are clear what is in the project, the orange part, and what is in the future, which is in the light blue. And the costs need to be consistent. You know, it's really important that everything is consistent, otherwise the analysis just doesn't make sense. Thanks, Simon.
Simon, sorry, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. I pressed the button.
We had another question come through before you jump into the form. Tina asked whether we expected to see updates to the energy price forecasts that we use to develop the counterfactual technology pricing. The last one was issued sort of fairly early last year. I wondered whether you knew anything about that. If not, I can relay the question to Bays.
We're pretty reactive on that. We know when they come out and we update the theme when it does come out, but we're just recipients of that information. We don't tend to know what the plans are at Bays, but it'd be interesting to know what their plans are.
Great. Okay, I'll forward that question across. Apologies, Tina, we can't give you more information at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we often have a bit of a discussion about which of the customers are in the scheme and which are in future decarbonisation, and it pretty much comes down to the degree of certainty. Sometimes, I mean, to be in the scheme, the customers have to kind of exist currently, and that might sound trite, but future decarbonisation customers could be customers that are identified through a future kind of master plan that a local authority has issued, where there's clearly going to be a new housing developments or new commercial developments being developed in an area that potentially hasn't even started yet. So it's often about the customers that are in the scheme tend to be those that have been identified, where there's been an initial contact with and discussion with, and where they are showing a degree of commitment to signing up to the scheme. They tend to be the customers that are in the scheme, and customers that are not in the scheme tend to be the that are in future decarbonisation are the more speculative customers. But that's can be quite a subtle distinction, but we're happy to discuss that as well. Okay, right. I think that's me in terms of the slides, but I'll just quickly show you the application form, if I may. So Sam, can you see this now?
Yeah.
As the application form. Okay, so so we're on the we've got the yellow.
Simon,
Do you
it's
want to
quite
make it a bit bigger? Okay, I'm on a massive screen. So okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Oh, make it even bigger. Okay.
For those watching, you can enlarge the screen by dragging upwards, if that helps at all.
Wow. Okay. I didn't know that.
But you make the little labels for the people smaller, and the screen, but you can see, gets bigger.
Excellent. Okay, so we have a number of the turquoisey type tabs that Sam talked through a bit, and then the yellow tabs, which are the theme tabs, the theme network inputs tabs. Then, so we start at the top with the generation technology. You say whether there's heating or cooling and electricity included, and it works a little bit like the rest of the application form, in that if you choose to include things, then it opens up the opportunity to put information in. So there's an energy generation technology choice type, and the units are in column H as typically. Then we have some information about each technology type, the choice. You've got a choice of fuel, and then we have the the fuel quantity, and if you hover over cells, you should get some notes prompting you to enter information. So this data goes all the way out to year 60, as I was saying before. So please populate it with 60 years worth of data. So there's a number of different technologies. There's probably there might even be 20 or so, but we only ever see 2 or 3 different generation technology types. There's some information about battery storage, energy center, the length of pipe work, some system loss information, and then total heat demand information. And then down here we have a tariff structure, which we ask you to provide some information on tariffs. And then here, this is kind of the heart of where the intervention calculation is driven from. So we ask for total summary revenues for the scheme in real terms, variable fixed connection fee, cooling, private wire, so they're greyed out at the moment because they weren't selected up at the top, electrical revenues, and then this other revenues. What we have seen in here is where the scheme is being supported by other streams of funding. So for instance, RHI income might well be presented in here. If you present RHI income in here, you should please also include the costs that RHI income is supporting. And that way, then the way the calculation works on the gap funding, we don't end up funding those assets twice because we've got the income is offsetting the costs. If you're not going to provide us with the RHI income or the income that is already supporting assets within your scheme, then the other way to do it is to exclude the income, but you would also need to exclude the costs related to that. We have a strong preference that you include the income and include the costs, but the principle is that HNIP doesn't want to be funding assets that have already been funded by other streams of support. So that's the revenue side of it, and then here we have costs, and we ask you to split costs between initial capex and repex, and between the energy centre and the heat distribution. The reason we ask for the split between the energy centre and the heat distribution is in order to do the state aid calculation, which makes that distinction. It has 2 limbs to calculating the allowable aid. And these boxes here with the ticks, summary costs are pulled through from the cost input sheets, and this is a reconciliation that we've provided to be helpful. So on the cost input sheets, we ask for quite a lot more detail around your capex, itemized capex costs. So this should record initial capex and repex, and by year, and then the totals at the bottom of this summary on this cost input sheet, so the totals down here feed into the totals in this box here in I611, for instance, and then that checks whether the numbers that you've provided at a high level summary level match to the detail that you've provided in the cost input sheet. So that's kind of internal integrity reconciliation. So these reconciliations come from the cost input sheets where more detail is provided. And then there's a little bit of a reconciliation just to check that the demand from customers doesn't exceed the capacity that your generation sources are generating. So that's that first sheet. Now here, where is it? In I642, this we've locked it. So this is an internal rate of return calculation. So this is calculating the internal rate of return of the net cash flows that are in this row for the first 40 years, and that gives you your pre-intervention IRR. So that's where you check to make sure that that's above zero. So that will be the pre-intervention IRR that we're working to, and you might want to satisfy yourself that that pre-intervention IRR calculated on a real pre-tax pre-funding basis is what you'd expect from what your financial model is calculating. So that's just a check for you as well. I'll whiz through the rest of these now. So the demand sheets. So that's future decarbonisation. So the demand sheets has heating and cooling customers. You set up your customers here. You say what the customer type is from a drop-down menu: building type, building age, whether they're a district heating customer, cooling, or a private wire customer. And once you've selected once you've input your customers, that then populates this information down here. And you probably need to choose that there. But and then that should then opens up the information down here for your customers. Please this information is important in relation to the SMPV calculation of the number of network connections and the number of individual customers. Because as I said, if it's a gas counterfactual, it'll multiply the number of individual gas boilers in a residence by the number of customers. And then this is absolutely critical. If this is missing, anything that needs a counterfactual won't be able to calculate within the theme, so we'll come straight back to you. That's the choice of counterfactual for customer type, if you can see that. And then over here, we have the profile of the demand for your customers. I think this actually, if you put annual heat demand here, it pre-populates it, so then you can, if that's right, that's right. If it's not, then you just overwrite it to give you your demand. There's probably not much more on this sheet. Private wire, and there's external exported power to the grid and the profile of it here if you're a CHP electricity generating technology. Cost inputs I've mentioned. This has quite a lot of, and Andrew will talk a bit more about this. This has quite a lot of detail in relation to the capex, the opex costs, and then finally the decarbonisation tabs, which seems to have got separated in this version of the model. So there's a future decarbonisation network inputs. So this is saying what is the replacement technology. So if you're replacing a gas CHP with a water source heat pump, you'd say the water source heat pump. If your technology, your scheme technology, your gas CHP was the first technology in the theme network input sheet, you'd say it was the technology number 1, and then you say what the likelihood is of its replacement from a drop-down menu, and then you say what the fuel usage is for that alternative energy source. We're not asking for cost information or anything. It is just what is your aspiration in relation to improving, if you are going to improve your generation technology, what year does it come on board and what fuel does it use, and then we can calculate the additional carbon benefit from that technology. And then for the customers, this is basically
just to chip in on the future decarbonisation technology. This is focused on schemes of which we've had a reasonable number, which start their life with gas CHP, and any scheme which starts with a fossil fuel-based technology is obliged to have a plan for decarbonisation for obvious reasons. This has moved on quite a lot, in fact, since HNIP started, and we're beginning to see those fossil gas projects disappearing anyway. So this is an obligation for a scheme which is using a fossil fuel to start with. But if you're starting immediately with a low carbon technology, there's no requirement to move to something else just for the sake of it. So if you're using already a low carbon technology, as in anything other than the fossil gas systems, then you don't have to make a change. Is that, I just realized I'm saying that without checking with you, Simon. If somebody's staying the same, do they not enter this at all? Is that the...
Yeah, that's exactly right, Andrew. We don't need the information here. You're already getting a very big score benefit. So if you start off with air source heat pump or water source heat pump or something from the start, or energy from waste heat, you're already getting a very, very large carbon benefit in the main scoring. So the fact that you're not getting an additional benefit here, that doesn't matter. So don't fill this sheet in. I think we would I think you probably should aspire to put something in the future decarbonisation if you can, because once the network
aspiration, more than aspiration, Simon, it's a requirement to have the possibility at least of expansion. So we'd expect to see opportunities for expansion, which, you know, or the schemes which come forward are meant to be able and intending to grow beyond their initial group of connections.
Okay, so as a matter of course, if we don't see information in here, we'll come back and raise the question. So yeah, expect to fill in this sheet, which is the future decarbonisation sheet. Again, the information is relatively minimal. What the customer type is, building type, certainty, and the estimated profile of demand from when they come on board, and that's kind of it from that perspective. I'm just going to have a quick look. I've got a list of what I call golden rules. So I've already mentioned pound thousands, units, kilowatt hours, megawatt hours. We need full 60 years of data. If any of these things aren't correct when it first comes in, we'll come straight back asking it to be sorted. Numbers in real terms, again, we will spot if they're inflating, and we'll come back and ask them to be up in real terms. Please don't include business rates in within the model as a cost. It might well be in your financial model, but don't include it within this model. BEIS don't intend to provide HNIP support to support business rates. That's just a policy decision. And the final thing is in relation to commercialization. So you're invited to or welcome to make a bid for commercialization funding, and this is some grant funding to support your commercialization activities that are often advisory type activities during the development stage of the project. You can put an application in for that. That application consists of a list of activities with with the estimated cost against those activities and a plan for when those activities will happen. So that essentially is the commercialization application. Please don't include those commercialization costs within these themed input sheets, because again, that would end up with you being funded for it twice. So we'll come back and ask you to remove those if we see those. So they were all my kind of issues that we often see that would be great great if your application forms came in and none of those issues were there, because then we could really concentrate on the value added stuff in terms of raising clarification questions. And finally, that pipe schedule, theme pipe schedule, is the one that I couldn't remember the name of. The ACOM technical advisors will have a look at the information in there. That doesn't go into the theme itself. Okay, sorry, that was although it was a rattle through, it took quite a long time, but that's covered my area. I'm happy to hand over to Andrew, I think, now, unless there are questions.
It's I have to say this method of communicating is effective because we all stay at home, but it's slightly frustrating because you don't really know if anybody's you can't tell if people are having a little snooze in their rooms or that it's all perfect and we're saying exactly what they want to know. So
Yeah.
we welcome questions on what we're doing, just as to know whether we're covering the ground that you need or we're not, and happy to answer things as you need them. I am going to Are you seeing my screen?
It's not come up yet, Andrew. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Okay. Oop. Okay, so we're back in the presentation. You've seen those already. So I'm going to cover a little bit about the way we look at costs, and I'm going to talk about deliverability and how that's the information and we need for that, and how that's assessed in outline. The way we approach the cost modelling, I should perhaps start with why we are doing cost modelling. You will understand that the purpose of HNIP is to encourage the take-up of heat networks, and that's why the government is investing in these schemes. We are investing taxpayers' money, and so it's obviously important that we are careful in the way that money is deployed. We want, and we have a constant battle between worrying that you've priced things too high and we might give you more money than you need, and worrying that you've priced things too low and we might not give you enough money and the schemes might fail. So our aim is to understand your scheme well enough to judge whether we think your costing is reasonable on both of those bases. It's obviously very difficult. Costing is an uncertain, it's a bit of an art rather than the science, and we have to do the best we can in order to be comfortable that the position you're in is sound. To support that, it really helps us a great deal if you're clear in the way you present your costs, to enable us to do our job more easily and everybody to have more confidence in what's going on. We know that this isn't straightforward because of the way costs are generated. You may be getting costs from a contractor who doesn't give you as much detail as you might like, and you may also have that's quite a common problem. But you should be able, well, we'd like you to generate cost in a reasonable level of detail. The way we review costs is based on this structure here and the CHROME acronym across the middle part of this. So the construction cost, the renewal cost, operation cost, maintenance cost, and end of life. End of life costs, essentially, we don't manage, but it's there for completeness. And obviously, you won't be surprised to know that first construction costs are the most important. But given that we're addressing these over 60 years, in fact, the renewal costs can start to be really quite significant if you're replacing large bits of kit a number of times. These aren't trivial, and we see some diversity in these figures, and we like people to think about them properly. Now, in our cost model, the focus is entirely on the costs of construction. That's why it's got the life cycle cost piece. So the cost model isn't interested in your income, which is in the model that Simon's been talking about, or any externalities which come under SMPV, and costs related not to construction, which, for example, the commercialization costs are in that category. So we are going to focus primarily on construction costs in this, but we'll pick up on the other elements. And then the next thing, to be clear about, just expand on what I was saying before about what we ask you to present to us. It's best for us if people can present costs in the way that's shown in the diagram. Now, obviously, not all schemes have all of these components. So if you don't have electrical distribution and you don't have cool distribution, then you don't need those costs. Equally, you may be incurring no costs whatsoever at the customer end. So we've got these different elements. Most schemes are presumed to have some sort of energy center, although in practice, sometimes they don't because they're just taking an offtake from an EFW plant. But basically, this is about the generation of the heat. This will be about the distribution of the heat. And these are costs to do with whatever works are needed at the customer end, which you may or may not include, depending on the way your scheme is organized. And in addition, we know every project has overall project costs. It's very important to us to understand, we prefer these to be isolated separately. But if you have, for reasons that you can't avoid, you're needing to have the project overheads and so on included in each part separately, then at least can you make that clear to us so we can unpick what you've done. And then in the analysis, you'll see reference to tiers of cost. And this again is about levels of detail. So if we take from the previous slide, the energy center as one of the tiers, costs associated with the energy center. Obviously, the cost of the energy center is partly about the physical cost of the building. The energy center, any utility buildings, any external works to support it. And then these could come down at tier 4 in more detail. The part which we're often most interested in is the energy supply service. So low or zero carbon heating technologies, the heat pumps or the CHP engines or whatever, but also other equipment. You may typically schemes have backup boilers for peak or for backup. And all the other stuff, pumps and pressurization and storage and so on. So all of that comes in here. And then in addition, of course, the utilities costs, obviously depending on the approach you're taking, whether you've got gas or electricity, water. So all of these things should be represented in your input. Why does all this matter? Well, I mentioned the challenge for us of understanding whether the scheme is good value for the taxpayer, and also is it well enough resourced. So that's the most important thing. In addition, the cost assessment is part of our scoring. So we score on the quality in terms of the breakdown of the cost plan. So you score better if you provide us more detail. That also helps with the second point, which is about the whether your costs agree with our costs. Which again, as I said, is helped if you've given us enough detail to unpick that, an explanation. Clearly, if you've got exceptional costs, then we're in general not going to disagree with those. So because those are clearly very, very location specific, you know, a crossing of a river or a railway line or something is a thing which depends on the circumstances. And then the third aspect of this is to the extent to which these cost assessment is well justified. Clearly, the best possible cost is a firm price from a contractor, so that we know that cost is confirmed. We also know that typically that isn't the point the projects are at, but we do need to know where it's come from and the extent to which it's reliable. It's maybe stating the obvious that it's very helpful if the values in the application form should match those in the evidence. If they don't, if you can explain why not, we recognise that projects evolve significantly over time, and it might be that your cost plan was provided based on one design and the design evolved a certain extent. Obviously, if it's a completely different project, we'd expect a new cost plan, but we can tolerate a certain amount of difference, but those should be explained. And we'd expect to be able to see where the source has come from. We expect to see the logo of the people who provided that information on the evidence to give us more confidence of where the information has come from. So just to give you an example about the level of detail, we've had a few applications have come in and it said CapEx, 12.8 million, and that really doesn't help us at all because our opportunity to analyze it is rather limited. So this is an example, this is a pretty good example of the sort of level that's really helpful for us in terms of unpicking it. We can tolerate a bit less, but it's good to understand that you can see that the logic of this built up against the different headings. So this is the built asset, the physical building, generation plant, and then a whole bunch of other stuff that makes up the cost. So this is, and then that's down to here, and then we've got additional cost, which is overlaid on it. Now, as I mentioned before, we actually prefer these to be like prelims and so on to be across the whole scheme, but that may not apply. So, present this information on the basis that you've got it, as long as it's clear. We can then unpick what's going on and understand the scheme. So this is a really good example. We could get away with a little bit less, but not 2 lines. In terms of RepEx, this is inevitably much less of it because typically there's only key plant items which will be being replaced, and we'd expect to see them fairly clearly shown in this, the major items. And similarly, there will be inevitably we'd expect to see maintenance costs. We'd be worried if there weren't any ongoing costs for maintaining the equipment as part of this. Important to note that fuel cost isn't part of this because that's clearly part of the main cash flow and comes into the aspects of the model which Simon was showing you earlier, but this is distinct from that. So to summarize on costs, the more detail the better. There is an other category. We really doesn't help us very much if you use the other category. If you do, please make sure you explain it properly what it is you put in the other category. Inevitably, there are every scheme seems to be odd in its own way. So if you can explain what it is that's distinct about this. It's really important to not include irrelevant costs, which they just mess things up and we have to get them taken out. What I mean by relevant costs in extremis would be things which would be fraudulent, like a new Daimler for the chairman. But examples of things, if we can't fund things that have already happened, so pipes that have already been installed, or they're things that aren't part of the heat network in general, even things which may help with low carbon technologies, low carbon aren't usually allowed as part of the heat network. So I'm thinking about PV panels. We're not here to fund PV panels, so they may be relevant and going on at the same time, but they wouldn't count. Similarly, works, we've seen it. We saw an application once that had lighting replacement as part of the cost because they were doing lighting replacement as part of the same contract, and that's got nothing to do with the heat network. Not that we're against people fitting better lights, but to be completely clear, if it's not part of the heat network, it's not relevant, and just don't include it. The costs that you present need to add up to the total that you're expecting to pay. So we expect to see all the fees, all the risk costing on costs in it, so that the answer is it's the bill that you're expecting to pay at the end. And if a cost is stated from the DNB as DNB tender, we expect to see that documentation. And if in doubt, speak to the assigned business development manager. I think in practice, it's not even if in doubt, speak to the assigned business development manager, get through to talk with somebody also from the AECOM team or from Astros depending on the types of questions you're asking. Okay, so that was a whip through on the costing side. Hopefully that was clear, and I'll move on and in the absence of specific questions at the moment, and talk to you about deliverability. So earlier on, Simon introduced the 3 elements which are scored from a technical point of view, heat and carbon, both divided by GGE, but also the future decarbonisation. The 4th element that's scored is deliverability. Now, deliverability includes a lot of different things, which you'll quickly realise means that each one of them isn't that can't be making that big an impact on the scoring. However, there are some elements under deliverability which will make the investment committee say this project isn't one we're comfortable to fund. So we need schemes which are deliverable, essentially, although this, as I said, the score may not matter, the IC may well decide that the scheme just is too risky and it won't go ahead with it. We look at deliverability under the 7 headings shown on the screen. These are described in more detail in the guidance, but it's useful just to run through this a little bit more, just to point out some key elements. Now, deliverability, we get projects which are applying for commercialization and construction funding, and projects which are only applying for construction funding. And it will be obvious that if a project is going into a commercialization phase, we'd expect it to be less developed. In terms of deliverability, we'd expect the score to be lower, which means we're not going to fail a project for a lower score at commercialization stage, because that just wouldn't make any sense, and that will become clear as I go through the other pieces. What should then, where this approach should help you is that the work you're planning to do in commercialization should be designed to address the weaknesses in the areas which we identify. And if you are successful, we will be providing conditions to funding to make sure that we're comfortable you've addressed those adequately to our expectations. If you're planning a construction only proposal, we'd expect nearly everything in this deliverability section to be in place. Essentially, if you can't answer all these questions and provide the evidence, then you're not really ready to construct, which again will become obvious as we look at the topics that are in there. Nothing we're asking here should be difficult, and if it is, then again it may well mean you're not ready to go to construction. Now, probably the single most important issue in deliverability is the key stakeholders, and in particular your paying customers. So it's obviously a big concern to us, as it would be to you, about the status of your negotiations with the paying customers. We know full well that many projects aren't going to have their customers signed up at the point of application, and that will be something which will be developed through commercialization. I think if you're going to construction and you haven't got your customers signed up, that could be quite a serious problem, to the point which we might well decide that it can't go ahead. So it's really important that you explain where you are with the relationship with your customers. Even so, the fact if you haven't got signed contracts, then at least what have you got? Where are they in the process with heads of terms, or the applicants, so your potential customers have got the documentation, they just haven't signed yet. It's possible they haven't signed yet because you haven't got your funding. You know, we're aware of that sort of chicken and egg thing going on, but this is obviously really important. And similarly, we've seen a number of schemes which are linked to an energy from waste plant. It would be a bit strange if you hadn't got an agreement with the energy from waste supplier for the supply of heat. That would worry us significantly, and we wouldn't release funding. And we may decline a project in that situation, or we may get to the point where we only release the money when we've seen the contract has been signed, which would be an obvious thing from the point of view of due diligence. So we'd expect that to be at least in draft agreement by the time we apply. Moving on, the technical aspects of the deliverability assessment. This is around basically building our confidence that you do indeed know what you're doing, which I'm sure we do. We basically want to see that technical design is developed enough. That's quite a difficult thing to describe, given the variation between schemes and the time when they apply. But we've seen a whole variety of schemes, from ones with really very detailed designs through to others where it's not quite done with a child's crayon, but it's not far off. And so we need to see enough development that means we can feel that the costings are likely to be reasonable, and that we can have confidence in it. We see a lot of projects seem to be reluctant to provide a decent program. We expect to see a program, if it's a commercialization project, quite a detailed program for commercialization is really important, and then probably a more outlined construction program, but still a construction program. And if you're seeking construction money and announce you're about to start in 4 months' time, then we're very surprised if you haven't got a detailed construction program. So we have to say, to challenge that. And so the failure to have a program might be sufficient grounds to refuse the project, because again, how are you ready if you haven't got one? In terms of finance and governance, it won't be any surprise for you to understand we need to know who's going to receive the money, where's the rest of the money going to come from, and in governance terms, how do the different organisations involved fit together, and who is the supplier of last resort. We have quite a lot of trouble with this, just in case you're not familiar with this. Most applications, but not all, but most, well, obviously every application, there's somebody who's planning to run the heat network. It isn't impossible that heat network supplier fails at some point in the future, and given that the supply of heat is an essential service and shortly to be regulated, we'd expect to know what's going to happen in the event of the failure of the supplier, so the supplier of last resort. I think you can all see that if you don't know the answers to these questions, then it doesn't look like you're really ready to go. There is a bit of an issue with who will receive the money, and this is something that you should talk through with us in detail, because quite often people are in the process of creating a joint venture or an SPV, and it may well be that ultimately that's where the money goes, and we can talk through what the options are in that respect. But we do need to know what your plan, your plans need to be developed so that we need to understand what's going on there. That was all I was going to say on that, because it's easier, better to answer questions on it. Sam, do you want to take this back for the last piece?
Sure. Well, there's only a couple more slides, so it might make sense to keep it open on your side. There were a couple of questions that came through whilst you were speaking, Andrew, actually. Okay. So the first one, is there recognition in the scoring that a heat pump scheme may require more funding to meet the hurdle IRRs, given the gap in support with RH high ending and the fact that CHP and energy from waste heat is typically much cheaper to generate?
So that's a good question. And from the perspective I imagine it's being asked, the answer is not in terms of the heat, so I think the simple answer is no. The expectation is a heat pump solution would score better on the carbon side, particularly than a gas CHP scheme, more complex for EFW. So we might well expect it would do better in terms of the carbon side, but a bit worse on the heat side, which will hopefully compensate it for the fact that it may well cost more. So the simple answer is no. We don't differentiate between technologies. We score in the way that Simon introduced earlier and I discussed on deliverability, and the most attractive projects receive the funding. We're beginning to see, well, yeah, so that's the answer to that question. And we're well aware of the challenge. We've got a number of projects which are hoping to be in receipt of RHI funding, and we're well aware that this is a challenge for quite a lot of projects.
Thanks, Andrew. There was another question in regards to internal heating systems. How do we include changes to those systems? For example, the move between electrical heating to underfloor heating.
Okay, so so basically it's in this diagram. So if it's necessary to do works in the customer buildings, it's included as in this section as whether these. So we in this area, as I expect most of you know, we talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary costs. So the primary costs for the heat network, the secondary costs, the internal distribution within a building, and then tertiary costs within, in domestic sense, within the home, or could be within different parts of a non-domestic building. And in principle, all of these are allowed where they are necessary and where they are additional. So they'll be necessary, obviously, if a building has got electric, say it had direct electric heating, replacing that with a wet system would be an allowable cost. I use the term additional because if the building is really old and needs the current equipment is failing, we'd expect to see an offset in respect of the cost of a like-for-like replacement of that. So we'd recognise that fitting a wet heating system will be more than replacing the direct electric system, but the cost of replacing the existing one wouldn't be zero. So it's quite straightforward to include as a cost. What people need to be wary of is if those costs are too high, it may make their scheme very unattractive. But they can be included in that place.
Thanks, Andrew. James, did that answer your question? Does that make sense?
Yes, it did. Thank you very much. We've got some very old buildings on a large agricultural estate in just outside Luton. So yeah, that makes sense. Cheers. Thanks.
Great. Then there was a question around whether there are fixed assumptions that should be used in relation to the counterfactual technology. I've sent into the chat the clarification note, which relates to the assumptions around counterfactuals. If you have any further questions on that, then please send them through. But all of the assumptions are outlined in that document. And then the final question: is it possible for the commercialisation funding to go to a local authority applicant and for the construction money to go to an SPV, which will be formed post-procurement?
Yeah, so I will attempt to answer this, and then if I think Amy's still on the call or Simon think I've got it wrong, because this is verging on the legal, which is not my territory, but it is possible. It's also just as possible for I think the expectation is that the local authority would receive the construction money and then give it to the SPV. We don't really see why that's a problem. If it is a problem, then that could be I think it's possible to negotiate that change, but I'm not sure that it's necessary, in that basically the local authority can receive the money and pass it on to the SPV. It's a bit more complicated in the loan situation, because clearly the issue for a loan is who the recipient of the loan is. Whoever the recipient of the loan is, they're the ones who will need to repay it. And so that's slightly more complicated than in a grant situation, which typically applies for local authorities, in which the money's not being repaid, so it doesn't really matter if it passes through the books of the local authority on the way to the SPV. Is that your understanding, Amy?
Yeah, I think so. As you were talking, then I was just thinking of the loan option as well. I think I will double check with yeah, like you say, LuxNova, and potentially I might have a check with the asset management team just to understand if they've got any steer on it. Because I know ideally if the SPV is in place, then they can just apply. But I think it should be okay, as you said, if it's a grant funding, I think that can be sorted out as it goes along. There will just be a few things to clear up if it's a loan, which again I'm not entirely sure of, but I'm happy to check on that one just to get a steer clear.
Great, thanks, Amy. Also, just posted in the clarification on SPVs. There is a section on the HNIP requirements for on-funding there. So I'll just paste that particular section into the chat for you, Andrew.
Yeah.
But if you have any further questions, feel free to get in touch with Amy or the team.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, so it would be great if somebody could get back to me once you've had your internal discussions. That'd be appreciated.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
One thing we didn't say, because it's not official yet, but it's tied up with commercialization funding and timing of construction funding, that it may feel like the end of the scheme is still some way away, because we've got funding rounds until the final one next October. But a key feature of the scheme is that we need to deploy the money before the end of March 2022. And that means if you're seeking commercialization funding, we need to get a move on, and you need quite a compact commercialization phase of your work in order to reach the point where we can pass the construction money on to you. Now, so that means that if you're applying in round 8, which hopefully some of you are, or 9, there'll be a little bit of time potentially for commercialization, but really not all that much. And if you're applying in round 10 or even 11, there'll be essentially no time for commercialization at all. So we're expecting at that point to be seeing schemes which are more or less ready to build. The one glimmer of hope in this regard is we may be allowed towards the end of the scheme to have projects which are commercialization only. Now, this is something which initially was very much something we didn't want to do. The idea being that we wanted schemes which were really meaning to build. And I can say this as a consultant, that sometimes consultants seek projects that they can work on in the hope they won't be built, so they don't carry any liability later in life. So we wanted schemes where that wasn't a possibility, and the plan was to build things through as long as it was all in good shape. But we're realizing as we're coming to the end of the scheme that simply may not be possible for some schemes, and so we can consider we're able to consider next year the possibility of commercialization only funding and we need to test how that might work for people. So if the reality is there's no way you're going to be ready to progress, if you can't progress fast enough, then it's still worth talking with us about your plans and how you want to take things forward.
Thanks, Andrew. That's a good point to make. So just to finish off, just a reminder that we have a number of resources on our website under the guidance material page. There are videos, so recordings of these sorts of sessions, but also individual videos which we've developed on some of the key scoring metrics, eligibility criteria, and the theme itself. So if you want to look at those in any of those areas in more detail, then those videos are available for you. We also have Lauren and Amy, our BDM team, and they are available to speak to you about your projects, the application process, and answer any of the queries that you have. So do get in touch with them. The best way of doing that is to email inquiries@tpheatnetworks.org. And then we've also published a number of documents. So we mentioned our application guidance. This is your Bible for applying for the scheme. We're hoping to publish the new version very, very soon. But there are also the clarification documents that we've talked about on the session today that provide a bit more information on some of those areas that we receive questions on a fairly regular basis. And the application form can also be found on our website. Just a reminder that we've funded projects. The website is regularly updated with news stories from those, so take a look at those. And we will be sharing a short feedback form after the session, so we'd really like to hear from you, get your feedback to help us improve our events moving forwards. So just leaves me to say thank you to everyone for joining us. If you do have any further questions, once you've reflected on the session today, if you email inquiries@tp-heatnetworks.org, we'll be able to get back to you. Have a lovely rest of your day.